Welcome to World History Notes, where I read from the book I wrote to teach homeschoolers world history. A Bible believer looks at world history. It's from the point of view of a Bible believer. So if you're a Hindu, Muslim, atheist, Roman Catholic, you might not like my conclusions or agree with them, even be offended by them, but you should know about these things. And so, whatever your conclusions are and whatever your opinions are, as long as they're formed from your study and not from some modern ideologue's opinion, um, then be happy. I'm just that you're thinking about it. So let's look at world history. We're going to talk about China. We're going to go back to the time period that I've been talking about, and we'll talk about China today and go move on to Africa. So now we'll move east to China, following the Han Dynasty, and after a further century of weak governing, a long period of division into northern and southern dynasties from 317 AD to 589 led finally to a new unification. The Sui accomplished this reunification, ruling from 581 to 618. Reading from F.W. Mote's book, Imperial China, we learned that the Chinese civilization had experienced a golden age of culture. Excuse me, I have interstitial lung disease, and some days it's worse than others. Experienced a golden age of culture under the Tang Dynasty that existed from 618 to 907. The Tang Dynasty, founded by Cao Tzu, experienced its greatest emperor under his son, Tai Tsung, from 627 to 650. By greatest, the historians mean to say that he murdered his brothers who were rivals for his throne and drove the barbarians back and reestablished Chinese authority over territories that had been lost since the collapse of the Han Dynasty. Suddenly, he is said to have grown tired of war and retired to study, read, and publish the writings of Confucius. His capital of Chang'an became so beautiful that Durant says that tourists flocked to it from India and Europe. Buddhist monks arrived in great numbers, as did missionaries preaching Zoroastrianism and Nestorian Christianity, which is a version of the Christian faith condemned at the Council of Ephesus in 431 that said that Christ was two distinct persons, the man Jesus and the Son of God, which resulted in the Assyrian church splitting from the Greek Orthodox. Oddly enough, Nestorius, its so-called founder, a 5th century patriarch of Constantinople, denied holding the belief. Theological debates aside, Tai Tsung held a very modern view toward crime, law, and order. He said, and I'm quoting from Durant, if I diminish expenses, lighten the taxes, employ only honest officials so that the people have clothing enough, this will do more to abolish robbery than the employment of the severest punishments, unquote. The unscriptural idea that only external conditions are basis for crime is held today as well. Compare the emotional outburst reported when he died. Excuse me. When he died, the grief of the people knew no bounds. Even the foreign envoys cut themselves with knives and lancets and sprinkled the dead emperor's bier with their self-shed blood. Compare that to the state of Baal worship in 1 Kings 18:28. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their manner with knives and lancets till the blood gushed out upon them. Durant quotes Arthur Waley, writing in the 14th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, as saying, quote, in the Tang Dynasty, China was without doubt the greatest and most civilized power in the world, unquote. At the height of it, it ruled Ming Wang, the brilliant emperor, who ruled for 40 years from 713 to 756 AD, with some breaks in his reign, the kind of which the Bible believer will find in the descriptions of Ahaziah's reign in 2 Kings 8 and 2 Chronicles 22. This can be found in the history of Vlad Tepes' History's Dracula, who reigned on 2 separate occasions over the same people, and other various monarchs and princes throughout history. Ming Wang was a complicated ruler who wrote poetry and attacked lands far from home, even exacting tribute from Turkey, Persia, and Samarkand. He fell in love with a courtesan, Yang Kuei-fei, formerly the concubine of his 18th son. Courtesan and concubine are two genteel words describing a not so genteel type of woman. Eventually, there was one of his ministers, Lu Shan the Tartar, read that barbarian, northern provincial governor, who also fell in lust with the same woman. He declared himself emperor, and a civil war was fought. Lu Shan called on his barbarian allies, and they sacked Chang'an in China. And out of China's already vast population, Durant tells us that historians of the time record that it was such a huge civil war, they estimate 36 million people lost their lives in the rebellion. Who's to say? Ming Wang won, but died a broken-hearted old man. This was the era of the great Chinese poet Li Po, whose mother was said to have had a dream of Venus in China called Tai Po Tsing, or Great White Star, at his birth. The Tang Dynasty, however, never recovered from Lu Shan's rebellion, or the massive destruction left in its wake. The Great Silk Roads, the avenues across Asia that brought silk from China and goods from Europe, reached the height of their importance, connecting the Tang capital to what the Chinese called the Western regions. Next came the era of the five dynasties and the Liao dynasty. Amidst all of this chaos, one soldier emerged to create the Song dynasty. His name was Tai Tzu. The most interesting emperor of the Song was Wang Anshi, 1021 to 1086. Wang believed that government must hold itself accountable for the welfare of all its citizens. The state should oversee all matters of commerce and industry, as well as government, to keep the working class from, quote, being ground in the dust by the rich. He abolished the forced labor that the Chinese governments had always enacted from the people to build everything from the Great Wall to roads. Like the Inca Empire, the government owned everything and distributed everything. Pensions were provided for the aged and the poor. To fight corruption, he had a budget commission that tightly controlled all money that government received. He put in place universal conscription, where every family was responsible for providing one soldier for defense of the country. His experiment at socialist government failed due to the universal objection to high taxes and absolute government control. In 950, paper money was first used in China. In 970, the first great Chinese encyclopedia was printed. In 1041, this was enhanced by the invention of movable type by Pi Xing. 1161 brought the first known use of gunpowder. Then in 1212, Genghis Khan invaded China and destroyed the Song, creating the Yuan or Mongol dynasty, whose most notable emperor was Kublai Khan. The Mongol Yuan lasted until 1368, when the Mongol control finally ended and the Ming dynasty arose, which lasted until 1644. During Kublai Khan's reign, in the latter part of the 1200s or the 13th century, a Venetian adventurer, Marco Polo, his father and his uncle, visited all of the East if they could. They stayed in China for a quarter century and were very successful under the Great Khan. Marco even rose to be the governor of Hangzhou under the Khan, a city he later claimed was more beautiful and further ahead of any European city in its hospitals, buildings, bridges, manners, and refinement. His travels are some of the most famous in history, and a study of his statements on the Eastern world through the eyes of a medieval European are fascinating. The Mongols were better warriors than administrators, and although Kublai Khan was no barbarian by any standards, it is a fact of history that it is easier to conquer a country than it is to occupy it for long. Once again, the Chinese married their conquerors, as they did each time the Huns, the Tartars, or any warriors from the steppes of Asia invaded them. Then they civilized them and finally overthrew them. In 1368, an ex-Buddhist priest led a revolt and entered Peking in triumph, proclaiming himself first emperor of the Ming dynasty. This dynasty, too, finally ended in chaos and rebellion and was overthrown by the Manchu invaders from what is now called Manchuria. Next, we're going to move to Sub-Saharan Africa, and we're going to talk about some things there that are very important through this historical period. Then we'll move over to the Aztecs in America. I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am, and I hope that even if you don't agree with anything I say or find errors of fact or anything you don't agree with, that at least you're studying world history to be conversant in it. Thank you and have a great day.